So I guess we've already done the quick intro. I usually hang out on the PowerShell Slack channel if anyone's a member of that. And the majority of my handles online are usually Rhys Evans. If anyone's interested, I'll be publishing the slide deck to the GitHub at some point over the next few days. So quick disclaimers. So this talk is more about the journey that I've been on with PowerShell and trying to change the culture, I guess, within the companies I've been at, and leveraging PowerShell and using that as a mechanism to accomplish that. So unfortunately, this isn't a PowerShell core demo, but a lot of it does apply to PowerShell core. I'll mention a couple of bits that I haven't managed to get working as we go along. And unfortunately, there's no demos. Joining Capgemini, they gave me a Mac. Yeah, for anybody that knows me, I've avoided Apple products for life, basically. New role, very excited, and then they gave me a Mac. So I didn't want to tempt fate, because I still don't really know how to properly use it. But that's something I'm working on, and a lot of it I'll hopefully be able to test with PowerShell Core, and potentially come back next year and do a similar talk with PowerShell Core. So quick question in the room. Who's written a script before? Awesome. So hopefully this talk will apply to you, and you'll be able to take something away from it. I've also tried to include something from different departments. So there's a bit of DBA, there's a bit of security, and quite a lot of operational aspects, or the operations teams. So just very quickly, why I wanted to do this talk. So I've been coming to meetups, and I get a lot of value out of them. And I've been going to meetups for well over a year now. And I thought, with all the value that I've had, I'd like to give back to the community. And one thing I noticed, there were a lot of talks that really focused around a particular feature or capability of PowerShell or a product. Nothing really stood out as how it all glued together. And that'll become clearer later in the talk. So when I start shortly, I set out and try and paint a picture of what life was like before my life as an automation engineer, and the pain and suffering that I was going through. Moving through the challenges that I was facing and some of the tools that I incorporated without introducing any technical debt, which was a big win for me, as you'll find out. And had I had or listened to a talk similar to this, or something along the same lines, I would have found that very useful and could have sped up a lot of the learnings and the learning outcomes and pitfalls that I faced. To start at the very beginning, I was at a large global finance institution, very typical ClickOps environment. The team was using SCCM, Active Directory, vSphere. Obviously, everyone that knows it's very GUI-based interactions, which take time, prone to human error, and just painful. So again, a lot of you could probably sympathize with that. And to graphically summarize that, there was a lot of this. Right-clicking, creating a new virtual machine, very frustrating. If you mess something up through the wizard, you'd have to start all over again. Summarized, it was long and tedious. And then not forgetting the wizards. So there was a lot of wizards involved. More wizards. And then when it finally finished and deployed, there was a check sheet you had to follow and make sure the latest drivers were there latest patches. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this and just feel the pain. And obviously nowadays, it's why are we still doing this? So I sort of set out to reduce the time spent doing a lot of the sort of typical ClickOps based work. But a more enterprise example, or a larger example, SCCM, although it's a great tool, it's very clunky, takes a lot of work to accomplish simple tasks. So for example, deploying an application takes a lot of time. You need to build out the collections, you need to build out the application, import it, and then distribute that to your environment, which can all add up and take time if you're doing it manually. So the team I was working with, we're all maintaining SCCM manually, so it was essentially one person's role to maintain and support SCCM. I thought, well, let's remove some of that stress from them and automate that away and make the whole environment a bit more slick and more efficient. So I got the team interested. I did some workshops with the team, showed them what PowerShell could potentially do, just random bizarre examples, like I managed to use PowerShell to do a matrix symbol in the console session, just to leverage some of the .NET APIs to prove that you could do really powerful things with PowerShell, and it's not like VB Basic or VB Script or even command line or batch. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough interest to get them to start developing their own scripts. So I sort of took it upon myself to realize what they were trying to do and basically script that away from them. So for example, the big one was importing applications and deploying applications. So I wrote a script to do that for them and deploy to the collections, and then have a switch that would push it out to the target collections. Oh, excuse me. And then other tasks, for example, SCCM was quite prone to failing distributing the content, so the PowerShell script that I wrote at the time looked for failed deployments and redeployed all the content. So I found that very useful as a tool or a mechanism to leverage PowerShell and try and bring the team better together. And the result, after a long time, was a folder of scripts that I knew what they did, but nobody else knew what they did. And there was a sense of version control, a painful version control. But there was no way of finding what functions were in which scripts, what they did, without actually opening them and delving into the code. So I thought there must have been a better way. And at the time, me and the missus decided to move to London. So unfortunately, I couldn't complete the journey there. So I sort of brought the whole principles with me to London and moved into a software house. And the software house that I moved into was a web-based SaaS platform, Microsoft stack. So I thought this could be a perfect opportunity to improve the internal automation there, as well as learning something new about PowerShell. So when I got into the new company, the new role, I noticed there was a lot of duplicating effort. So the DBAs were writing their own SQL provisioning scripts. The data implementation teams were writing their own SQL scripts. But the DBAs weren't reviewing the other scripts, and vice versa. And the DBAs weren't really publishing their SQL provisioning tools, or framework, to the wider audience. And then the dev teams had their own SQL deployment tools that they built with PowerShell. And it was just a lot of duplicating effort, and then trying to maintain that as an automation engineer was just painful. So again, I thought that was a perfect opportunity to try out and implement and streamline and bring the teams together. So I thought, let's do things right from the beginning. Let's try and get the teams talking together. And at some points, I did actually feel like this. Yeah, so I thought it was time to sort things out. But then that asked more, or presented more questions. How could I make the tooling or the framework that I was going to create safe, collaborative, easy to use, which was the key critical path, which sort of summarizes some other challenges. How would one execute the scripts centrally? Knowledge sharing I've already discussed. Avoiding duplicate efforts. For another one was role-based access control. So a lot of the user accounts and the service accounts were over-provisioned or over-permissioned. And I wanted to take that away from users because there was no reason for them to have it all the time. So having a delegated structure seemed to fit a lot better. And again, the logging, that nobody was having, there was no real clear structure of logging. So everyone had their own logging outputs. Nobody knew where they were outputted to. And as we go on later, it's it's a lot easier to do it within PowerShell than implementing your own logging. So as a software house, what I didn't want to do was introduce technical debt. I didn't want to support something. I just wanted to use something that's already there and leverage other people's efforts. Oh, excuse me. So I started going back to the list, each one in turn. So I noticed a lot of people were using Windows Task Scheduler to run their jobs, which is great, nice and easy to set up, but it doesn't provide any console output, doesn't let you pipe in any parameters. It also no real role-based access control, and high availability, well, there isn't any. If the box goes down, that's it. So it was a nightmare to work that into a scalable solution. So going back to Software House, I realized that they use Jenkins to build all their software. So for those that don't know, Jenkins is essentially a batch job scheduling service. So I leveraged that to compile and pull in all the jobs and be able to execute them within the environment securely. So I was able to use the secret store and the credential store to delegate access to particular services and letting the users execute the job without giving them direct access to the actual service. And then, as we'll come on now, this was an example of one of the Jenkins jobs. So you can have, I found it really useful that you can input strings, have drop downs, so you can really customize the experience that the user can have. And that's not an example of a PowerShell script, that's just random photo took online. So avoiding the duplicating efforts challenge. Working in a software house, source control seems the obvious choice. So using Git, we had GitHub accounts, built a repository, so I started moving all of our source scripts to GitHub that everyone could use. And the folder structure I went with was using a root folder for a particular module. and then having all the scripts inside their own file inside that folder. What that let me do was assign the code owners to particular departments. So for example, the DBA scripts I assigned to the DBA teams. So any changes or contributions to those modules, the DBA teams could instantly review, and the security teams would get notified. And it was a way to really start getting an insight into what people were using PowerShell to do in the production environments. And it worked rather well. Also, this had the added benefit that this was cloud hosted. So again, I didn't have to support anything. So that ticked the box. The next challenge was how do we get the resources and the modules into the hands of the end users? So it's all very well someone writing a script, but then how could we distribute that to the end user? Or the end engineer, I guess. And then how do we keep those resources up to date? How do we stop people from downloading a resource, tampering with it, and then either pushing it back or leaving it on the disk for someone else to use, and then potentially break something either maliciously or accidentally? And again, the key part of this was to remove any barriers to adoption. I wanted to make it as easy as possible for everyone to use it from opening up the PowerShell console. That was the goal. So I came across PowerShellGet. PowerShellGet, for those that don't know, is a way that Microsoft distributes PowerShell modules, resources from the PS gallery. All underneath is just Nugget packages, and this wraps essentially the Nugget executable and makes it really easy to use and package and publish resources to your repository from the PowerShell console. So that ticked the box. So that let me know how I could manipulate and pull content and keep it updated. The next problem was you can't communicate or talk to GitHub directly with PowerShell. So the next problem was how do I make these resources available for PowerShell to use? And the answer, I took inspiration from PS Gallery. So PS Gallery, for those that don't know, is Microsoft's open public Nugget repository or PowerShell resource repository. Essentially everything goes there. I have a slight concern publishing, obviously, custom internal resources to a public forum. So I thought, how could I do a lift and shift, use whatever technology powers PS Gallery and use it internally? So after a bit of delving and talking with the DevOps guys, I noticed that they used Artifactory. So again, for those that aren't aware, Artifactory is essentially a blob storage repository. It can host different types of repositories. So it can talk to S3 as a backend. It can use NPM nodes, PHP, Java. It's marketed as an enterprise universal repository tool or repository manager. And then I noticed it supports Nugget. So I was like, awesome. I've got all the tools that I need to build this framework. Let's put something and do a proof of concept. And that's precisely what I did. The final sort of challenge and the hurdle was how do I get PowerShell from a default Windows 10 instance or a Windows server talking to our now essentially custom PS Gallery service. And I essentially came down to two options. One, as part of the PowerShellGet module, there's a commandlet called register PS repository, which will let you configure your user space. Unfortunately, it's not machine-wide, to communicate to your repository. And you can query, as we'll come on to in a second, what packages are available, exactly like apt or apt-get or yum. Works in exactly the same way. But again, I didn't want users to have to do this before using the service. So I did a bit of digging using some sysinternal tools, sysmon or psmon. Noticed what register PS repository was doing in the background. I noticed all it was doing was creating an XML file in the user's app data directory. So I thought, awesome, I have Active Directory. I'll just distribute that manually. So as soon as the machine joins to the domain, they're going to get this new configuration for the PowerShell repository. And it works really well. In fact, it worked too well. And a lot of the machines got it straight away. I was able to automate a lot of tasks using SCCM that could pull down scripts using the repository instead of publishing all the modules in one go. It worked really well. So here's a quick example of how you would navigate your PS gallery, your internal repository. So you'd specify your name or your module name, your repository, and then how you would go about installing it. Again, I didn't want to trust the resources coming from PS Gallery, so I attempted to remove that from the config. But as part of that, because of the dependencies of some of the scripts, I had to copy the versions over to our own repository. But at least that way, I know it's trusted, I know it's signed, it's legit, essentially. So part of the last objective that I set out was how could I monitor what people were doing or what service accounts were doing. And because now we've pulled all the execution into a central service, Jenkins, I got Splunk, which was the tool or the monitoring tool that the company was using across the business to monitor everything. Pulling in the Jenkins logs, pulling in the Git commit history. I configured PowerShell's transcript logs by default. So everything that the user was doing was being logged to file, and then Splunk's agent pulled that. And also enabled PowerShell's one of lesser known capabilities, the script block logging, which essentially dumps the entire script block that you're trying to run in clear text into the Windows event log, which obviously if a piece of malware was trying to run a PowerShell script, you'd be able to pick that up pretty easily and see what exactly it was doing. But sorry, just take a step back. There's a PDF resource that I used quite extensively. It tells you exactly what to enable in group policy to enable Windows event logs. It tells you the event IDs, what to look out for, and even malicious commandlet names that are known to be out there in the wild to look out for. So based on this, now I know that PowerShell dumps the commandlet to the event log. This opens up a whole field of monitoring. You could monitor for data breaches. So for example, one idea I came up with, but never got around to implementing, was using Splunk's alerting features to look for regex patterns matching the account IDs or GUIDs that could have been in the production databases. and then alert off that. So if somebody was trying to exfiltrate data through PowerShell, Splunk would catch that, and we'd get an alert and capture it as it was in progress, which is quite useful. Then you could take that one step further. You could, based on the result of the regex pattern match, create a sub-search and actually search the database if that record actually exists. So you could do a real in-depth, real-time alerting on data exfiltration, which I thought was really interesting. But to take that, I guess, one step further, as part of Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016, I found that it has a anti-malware scan interface. So PowerShell leverages that to basically say, is this script safe? Is this resource safe? Yes or no. And then that gets handed off to the antivirus or supported antivirus, and that returns the result. So a quick example of that is the test case. So there's a test GUID that you can pass through that the antiviruses will catch, similar to the ACAR tests, if those are familiar with that. So at the top, you've got an example of a base64 string, and then PowerShell executing it. Yeah. But before it executes it, it first decodes the base64, and then dumps that to the event log, and then hands that, the plain text version, over to the AMSI or the scan interface. So it's a really powerful detection tool. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's a really powerful detection tool. So you can leverage AMSI to detect malicious content, even if it's encoded or padded or obfuscated. It is really good. So to quickly recap, I've now got the central script execution, which I set out to achieve. Using GitHub, I've been able to get the teams starting to collaborate and view each other's resources. Using Jenkins, again, I've been able to delegate the access control to production environments and production databases. And with Splunk's help, I've been able to log and see what people are up to from a security point of view. So on reflection, I feel like I achieved everything that I set out to do. And the added bonus was I did get support from the business, and it made life a lot easier. So a quick focus on some of the PowerShell aspects of this, and more examples. As I've really only spoken around the building blocks so far. So here's an example of when you create a module. I learned very quickly that you need to create a module manifest. So the manifest file is a metadata file that declaratively describes your module. And inside the manifest file, there's a required modules, so it's in this bottom half section. Bad example, there's nothing in there. But that's where the power of having your own repository comes in. You can specify a module inside required modules inside the manifest file. And once you either import or install your end module, PowerShell will go in the background and download and install the modules for you. So it's a really easy way of getting your environment set up indirectly and letting your users use your resources rather than having to set up and install their dependencies as well. So here's a very quick way. Well, I say quick, it's not quick. Here's a way you can create a manifest file, and the commandlet's at the bottom. And essentially, you're going from, instead of writing out in your script what modules to import, you're declaratively describing them inside the manifest file. And that's what it would look like. So in practice, so at the top, at the start of the session, those are the currently loaded modules. And then I'm importing the Flow Jira module. And then you can see on the third and fourth entry on the second half, you can see that it's automatically imported the Jira PS module. So again, if the user only imports the, required module, as the author of that module, you can reference other modules and dependencies, and it doesn't have to be PowerShell resources. So you could reference executables, libraries, anything. And going back to a security perspective, I'm quite keen on security. One of the lesser known features or capabilities that PowerShell has is the ability to code sign. So here's an example of what the PowerShell script looks like when it's being code signed. So it hashes the content, it hashes the file name, as I found out the hard way, and produces the hash signature at the bottom of the file. And even if you try to change one letter, the script will just refuse to run. Or if it's a module, then the module will refuse to import. And PowerShell will tell you why. So again, this goes a long way to stop people from manipulating the resources on disk after they've been distributed. So adding that extra layer of safety. And again, this is something that you can include as part of your pipeline. So as part of the Jenkins job and the GitHub source repos, I created a Jenkins job which pulled in every PowerShell module from GitHub, compiled them into a single resource, and then published that to the repository. And then as part of that, seamlessly in the background, I had it code sign the resource. So the users or the authors of the modules aren't aware that this is happening in the background. And it's a really nice, free way to secure your environment. Which comes on to the next topic. I feel everyone's guilty of using the execution policy bypass. I am. And production environment's quite bad. So I thought, now everything's code signed, we can roll out the execution policy all signed, so that only signed resources will be able to run in our secure environments. So again, because everything was handled seamlessly in the background with the Jenkins job, it was a free win. Nobody noticed. Until they started changing files, but I won't go into that. So again, what else could this be used for? DSC provisioning. So for those that are using PowerShell DSC, I also built an entire remote desktop services solution with DSC, including SQL servers, high availability service. And all of that was pushed through a pipeline using Jenkins and pushed out to the environment, using GitHub as the release gate, which worked really well. So some of the lessons learned. Making it easier for people to adopt your solution is what has to be the key. DBAs don't like touching, or anybody touching their databases. Find common ground. So I was quite thankful for the company I was working for at the time, believed in what I was trying to accomplish, and actually suggested that I'd hold lunch and learns. So they provided budget for pizzas every Friday, and around 10 people came every Friday. Some of them never used PowerShell before. So it was a way of getting them used to PowerShell and automating some of their tasks. Even simple tasks like creating Jira tickets. So I managed to get someone never used PowerShell before, didn't know what it was, to create a CSV file of essentially Jira tickets, and then using PowerShell to iterate through the CSV and creating tickets for each one, which they did really well. Find common ground. So I was using SQL as a lot of the company evolved around SQL databases. Everyone had to know what it was. So I was using SQL databases as a common ground, common technology that everyone could relate to, and then using PowerShell to enforce the sort of DevOps culture and the knowledge sharing. And again, bribing people with pizza doesn't hurt. So there's a challenge for any Jenkins PowerShell gurus out there. I've not been able to work this one out. When running a function inside a Jenkins pipeline, using the begin, process, and end blocks, it will not run. It just skips it. I have no idea. You can leave the script in, the content, just remove the begin, process, and end, and it'll work. Put those back in, and it won't. And there is no verbose output, not being able to track down why. So, yeah, if you've... Sorry?
Whereabouts were you putting your code?
Inside the Jenkins job as a SH.
Which block? In the function?
Oh, sorry, any of them, any of them.
So anything that's processed in the PowerShell function, the process block is processed once per everything's in the loop. The begin and the end blocks are processed once at the beginning and the end of the call to the function.
Yeah,
So it's
but
possible that one of your command line links in there is causing it to think it's a loop and spitting out, and you won't get any output then.
but it wasn't even doing the begin.
So you've got the function defined like that. Is that all that you have within the
No. So I'd call it at the bottom. Yeah. But that's one of the resources that was there. So yeah, food for thought.
So you're sure the function was loaded?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Definitely. And then the important thing. Oh, that's half past. Last one.
May I have
Version
your
control.
attention, please?
Oh, go on.
May I have your attention, please? The public address and fire alarm systems are about to be tested. The fire alert signal will first sound, followed by the fire evacuation.
Basically, always increment your version numbers.
Please take no further
PowerShell will refuse and will not publish versions of your resources if they already exist in the module. Didn't find a convenient way to get around that, but just, oh my God. Okay, fine. Give up.
The test is now complete. If you had difficulty in
And that's basically
clearing messages or fire alarm signals, please advise main
Yeah,
reception.
sure.
Thank you for your cooperation.
Did you integrate any tests in your CI pipeline?
No. So this was more of a proof of concept to try and get people on board. And then sort of the next iteration of this would have been to include things like Pester and that sort of stuff. But trying to get people on board with the pipeline and then DevOps principles, I guess, behind it. I saw the testing aspect as a bit of a blocker. Once they were on board and understood and used to the idea of contributing their source code through Git, that was going to be the next step.
Okay,
Yeah.
we are out of time. Rhys, many thanks for taking us on your journey. Lots
No
of
worries.
interesting ideas for people to take back. We've got a challenge. Rob, you can stand Jenkins up in a Docker container really easily, so I'm sure you're going to hopefully run with that one, maybe. But let's give Rhys a round of applause.
Cool. Thanks very much.